Hello, everyone. Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening. This is Tu Lang from the Department of Geography at the University of New Hampshire. Today, it is our great honor to have Dr. Yu Zhou to speak about China's models of innovation. Now, before I introduce our speaker, I would like to thank the sponsor for this event, the Confucius Institute at the University of New Hampshire. Now, every year, the CEI funds a series of public events bringing in the most important scholars in their respective fields from all over the country. Our thanks also go to the director of the Institute, Wang Yige, who has for years made great efforts to promote China-related research at UNH, the academic and cultural exchange between the US and China. It is truly unfortunate that the CEI at UNH will be discontinued this coming summer. So ours is perhaps one of the last public events supported by the Institute. Now let me introduce today's speaker, Dr. Zhou. Dr. Zhou is a professor of geography in the Department of Earth Science and Geography at Vassar College. She received her bachelor's and master's degree in urban and environmental sciences at Peking University in 1986 and 1989. And PhD in geography at the University of Minnesota, Twin Cities in 1995. Her research has been in the areas of globalization and high-tech, urban sustainability in China, and China's path of innovation. She is the author of the book titled The Inside Story of China's High-Tech Industry, Making Silicon Valley in Beijing, published by Rowman and Littlefield in 2008. And co-editor of China's China is Innovation Nation, published by Oxford University Press in 2016. Dr. Zhou has published extensively in top journals such as World Development, Journal of Economic Geography, and Environment and Planning A. She is a recipient of several major national and international awards and grants, including NSF, Asian Network, Lincoln Institute, Jiang Jingguo Foundation, and the Pacific Cultural Foundation, and many others. She has been selected as one of the public intellectual fellows from 2008 to 2010 by National Committee of US-China Relations. Today's event will last for about 1 hour and a half. After Dr. Zhou's talk, I will invite two of my colleagues who also co-organized the event with me to have a short conversation, to have a short discussion with our speaker. After that, I will open it up to the audience for Q&A. So for the audience, please leave your questions in the Q&A box at the bottom of your Zoom interface. I think now I will stop here and pass on my microphone to Dr. Zhou. Now let's welcome Dr. Zhou.
Thank you very much. I want to thank Professor Tulan Li Cheng and Andrew Earls for inviting me for this lecture. I'm sorry I cannot be coming in person, although it's good to see the background of Professor Tulan's campus. And hopefully one of the, maybe in the fall season, I think that I could come to visit. And I also want to thank for people both on campus and off campus. I think it's really now I'm getting really appreciative for the Zoom features, which allows for broader participation. So today my talk is about the China's innovation model. So if you don't mind, I'm just going to start to share my screen. So I think this would be the way. Okay, so are you seeing my screen searching for China's innovation model?
Yes.
Perfect. All right, so let's get started. There we go. Okay, hopefully nothing is wrong. So we know that in the last few years that we have seen technology has emerged into an area of a heated discussion and debate between US and China. And we have various actions such as trade war And the US complains about China's ambitious technology catch-up project called Made in China 2025, and Southern Talent Program, which is the Chinese government recruitment for leading technological talent program from all over the world. And you might also have heard about Huawei, as well as a number of Chinese high-tech companies are put on entity list, which block their purchasing of key parts from American suppliers, right? So, and with the rise in China, there are a series of actions of American strategy to action, and part of which has to do with increasing competitiveness within the United States. And I think Biden's was 2.4 trillion project probably will put some money into that. But mostly what we have seen is the effort of slowing China down, and that include curtailing critical part, as I mentioned, for Chinese tech companies, restricting of Chinese foreign direct investment into the United States, and reduction of scientific collaboration with China through the DOJ's China Initiative, and restricting for student visa, which could be for certain field and from certain universities. So if we look at these actions, there are some assumptions, as well as, I would argue, blind point in the sort of rationale behind these actions. So I'd like to give you some example, what I see as both sort of a master narrative and the blind point, right? So often technology between US and China is framed as superpower dominance. But technology development can also be symbiotic as well as complementary, and that was often missing from the discussion. And with the various actions to stop supply to Chinese companies, as well as the restriction of student learning in the United States, it is assumed that the American knowledge and technology is the primary source of Chinese technology, and which generally says very little or pretty much ignore the Chinese internal capacity. You know, is there China's internal capacity to develop innovation? And a lot of attention was paid by Chinese state as the driving force behind China's technological progress, but there's very little discussion about the track record of how Chinese state is doing in driving the technology. And pretty much very little discussion about the role of China's massive market. And then the discussion of intellectual property right has been emphasis about ownership and a monopoly, but very few discussions about the value of IPR in application. Intellectual property right is not just any property right, right? And so the value of technology are in its application. If you don't use it, it's not going to have much value. So I would argue that, you know, so basically what I'm going to talk about today is my research, but obviously my research wasn't developed in response of these debates that happened the last few years. But I do think that the research reveals some of the blind point of these strategies that are driven US decision making. So the question, whether China could be innovative, I'd be interested in this question, as Professor Lan said, since actually 1999. So my first book, Beijing's Zhongguancun region, the making of Silicon Valley in Beijing. So the start investigation in about year 2000, how this region transformed itself from a sort of a higher ed area into a technology center. The most recent book, China as an Innovation Nation, is really a collective effort, me with two other co-editors and over 20 authors who are expert on different Chinese industries. So I'm mostly going to focus on the most recent book. But before we delve into that, I would like to first define how we think about innovation and innovation nation. So, and there are different ways people define innovation, obviously, different type of innovation. So here we actually define it very broadly. This is a very sort of a broad economic concept by my colleague, Bill Lazonick. So innovation is a process that generates a higher quality, lower cost product than what's previously available. So this is a very broad definition. So if you can produce a better product, either in the form of higher quality or in the form of lower cost, you are innovating. And what is innovation nation is signify a national economy that acquired the capacity to produce a higher quality product than it was previously capable of producing. So if the national economy could provide continued improvement of their product in terms of higher quality, you are an innovation nation. And so if you define innovation in such a fashion, we understand innovation as not some heroic act of some individual that developed something, all of a sudden, you have innovation, but rather to think about it as a cumulative process and as a collective process, that in the sense that you are making improvement on top of other people, and while other people make improvement on top of you. So that's a collective result and cumulative consequences. So that's how we define innovation. Now, in terms of a national model of innovation, obviously you have to abstract it to a certain level, right? So I'm going to give you examples of what we mean by national model: South Korea, Taiwan, US, and Germany, just so you get an idea how we think about the national model as a more abstract level. This is the sort of Lin Soo Kim. He's very famous to characterize South Korea's model as being called from imitation to innovation. So South Korea started in the 1960s as really simple duplicative imitation of Western product. In the 1980s and 90s, it started to add some twist that to work with the domestic market. But now we all know South Korea is one of the global leader in terms of technology. In the process of South Korea developing technology, it's very much a top-down process. Top-down meaning that the government or the state take a central importance, collaborating with Chaebol, which is large conglomerates, right? Samsung, Hyundai are good example, large conglomerates that are dominating Korea's economy to the point that some people call Korea Samsung Republic. So it's extremely top-down concentrated approach in terms of technology improvement. And in contrast with that is Taiwan, which is also one of the East Asia tigers or dragons, whatever you call it. So Taiwan model, at least initially in the 1980s and 90s, was based on decentralized small, medium-sized enterprises. Of course, nowadays, they have also gigantic enterprises. But small, medium-sized enterprise and network characterized Taiwan's industrial taken off. But also different from Korea is that Taiwan companies tends to insert itself into the global production chain rather than develop their own brand, right? So the best example of that perhaps is the Foxconn being the subcontractor for Apple. And so you don't buy Foxconn brand phones, and you buy Apple phones. So there's very little brand development, but rather Taiwan company have inserted themselves as indispensable player in the production network globally. So what about the United States, right? This is again my colleague Bill Lazonic. He divided the US model into two stages. Prior to 1980s, much of the large US company is vertically integrated. So the technology and knowledge are produced either by public research universities or by corporate R&D centers. So the employment are mostly lifetime employment. So I live in Poughkeepsie, New York, which used to be an important site for IBM, which started here in 1940s. And from 1940 to 1992, IBM did not lay off a single person involuntarily, right? So but after 1992, the whole model changed that. So there are rounds and rounds of layoff. I think right now IBM did not really have presence in Poughkeepsie anymore. It used to be 2/3 of the town population have some relation with IBM. So after the 1980s, the new business model are something we are much more familiar with, which emphasizes open technological platform, and the R&D are often happen in startups. And large companies will merge and acquisition to acquire them. And venture capitals, IPO, and stock option became the driving force for innovation as well as compensation. So what is featured now is a flexible workforce, as most of people are familiar with the so-called gig economy. Now, another Western model, German model, however, is quite different. That instead of sort of rely on venture capital, IPO, Germany is renowned for its precision manufacturing. And many of the German companies are stable family enterprises over several generations. Extremely strong vocational training systems, and which generated high quality but also quite stable workforces. German company would be reluctant to lay off their workforces even during the process of downturn, right? So that's sort of the four model roughly we talked about. Where does China situate it? Well, interestingly, China trying to copy all of them. At different time. So in the 1980s, when China started to open up, and especially special economic zone in the coast, invested by overseas Chinese mostly, and that was pretty much along the line of Taiwan, small, medium-sized business model, export-oriented, subcontracting networks, and so on. In the 1990s, Chinese government started to really trying to imitate the South Korean model by building the national champions, right? So we'll talk a little bit more about that. In the 2000s, US new business model became extremely influential. China has built at least 2 or 3 stock market trying to be looking like a NASDAQ. And China's venture capital is one of now the largest in the world. The German model actually was the initial inspiration for Made in China 2020, is to produce upgrade sort of high quality precision manufacturing. So since China attempt to imitate all these models, and it's going to left the imprints in different industries. So our work in the China as Innovation Nation is really looking at the different industries. So this is somewhat different. I'm not talking about sort of one piece of technology like a blockchain or AI or quantum communication, which can be applied into different technology. Instead, we're tracking the industrial evolution in China and trying to see, how do they innovate, or do they innovate, right? So we argue that not all industry are created equal. technology change are quite different. Like say, high-speed rail technology do not change very rapidly as compared to cars. Every few years, major technology underneath the automobile could change, but that would be really slow compared to, say, mobile phones, which technology changes every few months. Right. So, and the market, the nature of market are also different. Some markets are consumer markets, other markets are really industrial markets, right? And so that affects competition. Certain competition, like in mobile phones, extremely intense, but maybe not so much in the high-speed rail. So because each industry have different combination and their innovative dynamic are also quite different. But of course, the point isn't to talk about each industry, is to find, well, is there a commonality of these industries that could help us to understand what China's innovation model? I was the main editor of all these chapters, and after going through all of them, I have a very hard time to really create just one model because China is way too big and things to change too rapidly. But I was able to get some common characteristics for Chinese technology industry. So I'm going to summarize that. And my summary is really, I use the word dynamic to describe it because they have a lot of letters. It allows me to use these letters represent different things. So let me start with the first letter, which is the D, right? So D refers to dual track. Now, when you talk about China's innovation, often people talk about as if sort of everything is top down. Certainly that Chinese state is extremely powerful, that and there are multitudinal ways Chinese government can influence technology through state-owned enterprises, through R&D funding, industrial policies which favor certain industries which are deemed strategically important, subsidies, technological standard, state procurement, which is state purchasing. Of course, these tools are not exclusively to China, that many other countries also deployed it in one way or the other. Like, if you see about our vaccine development right now, right? So the US government supplied a lot of funding, and we also guarantee purchase of the vaccine if the company produced them. So, and so there are various ways in which that state are influential in that. But often we also have to remember that top-down is not the only way that Chinese technology development. There's a tremendous power in the bottom-up forces, intense market competition, enterprise network, and Chinese companies are really good at rapidly responding to the market changes. So I'll give you some examples to demonstrate this dual track system. So on the one hand, we can see this is the sort of curve is the state funding of major technology, mega project, microchips, broadband, alternative energy, aerospace, disease control, and fuel vehicles. And so state council designated these are the area we're gonna invest. And so there's tremendous amount of rising in state funding after 2006. Now, but if you look more broadly about where the money goes into R&D, and then you find the state are not even the primary source of income of the spending. So this is between 1995 and 2006. So in 1995, the yellow is the university, the light blue is the research institute. They're all small, but they're not that different, right? So, but as you go along, you can start to see, research institute and the university are the primary place where state funding goes to, right? So you can see that. They grow quite rapidly after 2005. However, they're really, really overwhelmed by the R&D spending from the enterprises. So this is a much bigger drive in terms of R&D and not by the Chinese government per se. So that's sort of a good graph about the dual track I'm talking about here. I can also give you some examples of what are the top-down and the bottom-up industries. So the bottom-up industry are the ones you probably can feel quite easily if you go on Amazon to order something, electronics and small appliance. You'll find almost 40% of the third-party sellers are from China, right? So they got this brand name you can pronounce, but you don't really know what it means. You never heard about them. But rather the variety of product and the both for export and domestic are extremely competitive, diverse, right? And these tends to be labor intensive, low entry barrier kind of industry. They have very low profit margin, but so which means they don't spend a whole lot on strategic R&D and their low capitalization. But nevertheless, there are many of them, they're highly competitive, they're very much responsive to diverse and changing demand of the market. You pretty much can find anything that you want to find. So if you go to Chinese Taobao, that it's a good example of these products. Many of the Chinese, these products start what we call the shanzhai, which is a derogatory term, basically means knockoff product. But some of these companies begin with shanzhai, but become sort of a brand name. I think Xiaomi is a good example. It's imitate other Apple or other product and cell phones, and now Xiaomi is a well-known brand, at least in China, as well as places like India and developing world, and increasingly in the United States. That apparently it just recently hit the third largest cell phone seller in the world. So that's sort of the bottom up type of industry. And what about top down? So in the 1990s, also 1980s, the Chinese government felt these sort of grassroots small businesses is not going to fulfill national need. So they're going to try to build national champions for capital intensive and tech intensive industry, right? So we have high-speed rail, automobile, and semiconductor being the example. So, and what the Chinese government tried, sort of thinking about Korea model, is to build these either state-owned companies or joint ventures, and they provide a monopoly of national market so you can become really big, right? And that process involves forced technical transfer. So if you have joint ventures with a foreign company and you have to transfer your technology to the Chinese partner, and this is called exchange market for technology. So as exchange, you allow to come to sell your product in the Chinese market, you have to sell. Transfer technology. And this is something Americans have complained a lot. Okay, how did it work though? It's a different story. So looking at the high-speed rail, for example, the Chinese are incredibly proud their high-speed rail systems. It is fast, safe, efficient, and reliable, right? So I highly recommend anyone who have not been taking Chinese high-speed rail to do so. So for example, from, if you think about from Boston to Washington, typically in the American rail system, it'll take about 8 hours. And if you drive, it's probably take as much, right? But from Beijing to Shanghai, it's about twice as long. It took 4 hours. And it's about the same distance actually from New York to Chicago. And imagine that distance be covered in 4 hours, and a safe, clean, reliable, and incredible accomplishment. High-speed rail industry is a good example of extreme top-down system because its entire system was orchestrated and implemented by one governmental entity used to call the Ministry of Railroad, and now China Railroad Corporation, a gigantic state-owned enterprises. And so the corporation plan, construct, operate, and regulate railroad systems. So a single one, right? And it is installed over about a decade or more, right? But most of it, you know, the first part of it really installed very quickly over a decade. And the Chinese government or railroad corporation were able to get really favorable technical transfer agreement from foreign suppliers. You could say, oh, okay, so this is an example that Chinese government affords technical transfer. However, the situation here is quite unique. High-speed rail technology invented several decades ago from Japan has been relatively stable, I would say stagnant. They're over-the-shelf technology, and there's very little international market to go to because, you know, very few countries, including the United States, well, have plans to have the high-speed rail system, although I think the new Secretary of Transportation said he wanted to. We'll see. But there's just very few countries have this market. So for the foreign technology owners, either you leave this on your shelf forever, or you would be transferred to China to have incorporated to one of the largest, well, not one of, the world's largest railroad systems for technologies that are invented for decades and decades ago, at least 5 decades ago. So there's not really a whole lot of other ways for these tech companies to hold on to this technology. I mean, they by license to China, they actually, you know, get some use for it, get money, even if they eventually have to transfer this technology. So, and the other reason China was able to install the high-speed rail system has to do with the land is owned by the state. So the land procurement is relatively easy. And the reason the train can go fast, that the track has to be straight, right? So otherwise, if the track is not straight, it's going to slow it down or you go off track. So in that case, the land procurement ability of Chinese state to find the straight tracks are extremely critical. So here's your high-speed rail story. I would argue that it's quite exceptional. It's not something you could replicate in other sectors. And this is true, for example, the Chinese government tried actually prior to the railroad, it tries to do that with automobile as well as semiconductors. So the state trying to bridge this marriage between foreign technology companies and the Chinese state-owned enterprises, and they have to sign transfer agreement as a part of exchange market for technology. However, you know, if we think about one of the most famous example is Volkswagen and Shanghai Auto, that's that joint venture for building automobile for the Chinese market. But throughout the 20-some years of its existence, that Shanghai Auto never really got to understand, have control or understand of technology. So it became sort of a marketing branch of the foreign partners. So there's not much internal R&D. And the technology that was transferred is one generation behind. So because the Chinese partner never really get much control of that technology, there has always been this persistent gap and dependency on foreign parties. So even though this agreement was celebrated at the time, from the Chinese perspective, it didn't really get to transfer much transfer of technology. So it is generally viewed as a failure in terms of technological innovation. Similar stories are true for semiconductors as well. In the 80s and 90s, and Chinese government have built several joint ventures with foreign capital. And still to this day, that China's semiconductors still behind of a major global company or Taiwan company. And so this sort of joint venture arrangement used to be dominant in auto industry, has came to an end and pretty much end by 2022. But in Tesla's building already, like most of companies started building their own wholly owned company. Tesla, for example, its establishment in China is wholly owned. It's not partnered with anyone. And joint venture are also uncommon now in semiconductor as well. So these are the examples of how, you know, the top-down state management of these sort of forced tech transfer in most cases actually were not successful. So that's my long story about the first letter D. The other ones are much faster, okay, I promise. And so the Y is referring to sort of use of Chinese enterprises, because most competitive Chinese, all the competitive Chinese enterprises developed after 1980s, most of them in the 90s or even 2000. So there is a sort of usefulness about the enterprises as well as the founding entrepreneurs, right? Many of them fairly young. And Li Zhenzhenfei, the founder of Huawei, is fairly old. I think he's in his 70s now. And the other thing too is that the Chinese business model, technology business model, also changing quite rapidly. And the market is generally catered to the youth market. So that's sort of why. Next, these NAC letters refers to the kind of industrial ecosystem most Chinese tech enterprises find themselves. So China now produces a lot of unicorn, and these terms to describe rapidly growing tech companies. But if you look at this unicorn, they do not come from vacuum. They come from regional cluster in space, that's C, such as Dajiang, which is the Zhou company that emerged out of Shenzhen, which have many sort of concentration of hardware company supply chain. And these companies are networked. So each specialize different aspect of the industry, and each of them engaging incremental adaptive changes of others. And so this sort of industrial ecosystem is really a key characteristics of Chinese technological region. And if you think about that, in the United States, because we're functioning under sort of a shareholder maximization, shareholder income system, so where many of our companies are really interested in maximize profit or quarterly earnings. So we tend to sort of spin off not so profitable sectors or segment to other companies, in many cases to other countries, right? So this sort of outsourcing since the 1980s are pretty much dominant in the US. So at this point, we find ourselves like, you know, in the beginning of the pandemic, we could not supply PPEs because everything seemed to be made elsewhere. In China, the supply chain, the comprehensive supply chain is extremely important. So even if certain segments are not making high profit, there's a variety of effort both from the government and the enterprises to keep keep it in the cluster. So you have these sort of a supply chain system. So that is, if you look at mobile phones, automobile, or machine tools, or semiconductor design, they are all sort of embedded in industrial ecosystems in the region, mostly in Guangdong, Pearl River Delta, Yangtze River Delta, Shanghai, Suzhou, and also Beijing, Tianjin region. These are the three biggest industrial hubs, but there's also smaller hubs in Wuhan, Chengdu, in inner China. So the industrial ecosystem are extremely important. The last two letters are the competitive strategies of Chinese companies. I call them middle market. Middle market is in relation to wealthy market. In, say, United States, Europe, and Japan, these are wealthy markets that people have demands for high quality goods, right? And it's also in relation to some Indian scholar called the bottom of pyramids, which are the sort of really poor, large number of really poor population. So some of the Indian scholars saying, innovation targeting at the poor population is also innovation, it's important. For China though, the most enterprises thrive on the middle market. That is the very large and growing the middle class population. So, and Chinese middle class really, really desire the most up-to-date technology, but it has to be affordable for them. And here I differ quite significantly with some other scholars that I was listening in Clubhouse a few days ago that one of the scholars saying like, oh, Chinese older people really don't care about technology. They care about, food and chicken, beef, or pork. I really disagree with that. I think the Chinese middle class are incredibly interested in most up-to-date technology, but they really want them to be, they don't have to be great, perfect, high quality, but they're so-called good enough innovation that people can use. So it is that middle market that you find most Chinese companies thriving. And it is also the ways in which why I'm saying the technology is symbiotic is that for American part suppliers, this is the way for them to enter the Chinese market for product they themselves could not make at that cost. So the Chinese company would use American suppliers with German, South Korean, Japanese, and to bring that to the Chinese consumer at the level they can afford. And so that's one strategy. The other strategy is what we call system integration, this integration. So basically Chinese companies specializing in selecting and integrating parts and technology from different sources, American, Europe, Japan, so they could integrate it into a product to serve their Chinese market. So system integration is pretty much dominant in almost all sectors we look at, from cell phones to high-speed rail. So that's what Chinese companies specialize. Again, we're talking about the symbiotic kind of existence. So you have access to all these technology from the world, how you integrate them into your product. Now, that became problematic nowadays as America has now restricted the part supplier to Chinese companies. And so now we're start to see some of the different strategy evolve, right? And so, so this is sort of for what government say that what Chinese companies should do. So from 2006 to 2020, Chinese government advocated what is so-called 自主创新. If I translate word by word, it's called self-direct innovation. Although in the West, often translated into indigenous innovation. Unfortunately, that's a mistranslation. 自主创新 means self-direct innovation. It is pretty much a system integration. Basically means that you could get parts, you understand, select, learning these parts from all over the place, and you put them into a product that you can control for your own market. So it's emphasis strategic control, but it does not emphasize indigeneity. You don't have to invent on your own, right? So that was the main guidance for until 2020. And now after 2020, with American supply and the Western supply become a problem, then now you see the state have a different wording. It's science, technology, 科技自立自强. Science and technology is self-standing and self-strengthening, right? So here they're saying, okay, we can't just count on other people give us parts, so we have to self-standing, we have to create a foundation, so we have to do basic research and start building the foundation from up. Whether China could do that is still uncertain because obviously it's still quite new and there are a lot of effort for previously, that's not what China did. However, so we can say that sort of in the short run, certainly China would need to slow down because it has to go back to these foundations, reinventing some whales, if you may. However, in the long run, if they're able to reinventing the whale, that is to say, if they figure out the pathways that are independent of global suppliers, and that would be a problem in the long run for these global suppliers if they were to access the Chinese market, because technical system integration could change quite dramatically. If I don't use your part anymore, it's difficult to reintegrate you back in. So short-term Chinese enterprise will have problems, but long-term, we may also run risk for American suppliers. So just very quickly, what are the lessons we learned in terms of going through the sectors? That Chinese, I don't have a sort of single model of Chinese innovation. They're diverse across industry and time. And the state top-down process of technology transfer did not always work. It works in exceptional cases, which is the high-speed rail. The domestic middle market are the fundamental drivers for many, almost all of these industries. And so Chinese technological innovation have so far been derivative in nature, meaning they're building on existing technology, best technology in the world. However, under the geopolitical circumstances that they are seeking independence. So that's sort of a quick summary of what we have surveyed at the other sector. But the book was published in 2016. So one thing I kind of always regret about that book is that we were not able to find anyone to write informatively about the biotech sector, which is a gigantic, important sector. And the reason there were no biotech sector is because China's biotech sector is quite bad. By the time we published the book, somewhere early 2010. And so biotech sector is different from others we covered because it is a science-based sector, science, the rest of it's more like technology. And this is really about basic science. And this is one sector China had tried to develop since 1980s. It was strategically important, but it didn't seem to work. And even compared to India, China was lagging behind pretty much by 2010. And here is WHO assessment of China's pharmaceutical industry by mid-2010s, and says Chinese pharmaceutical industry has concentrated on producing basic chemical and active pharmaceutical ingredients. And apparently China has dominated API supply for the US, which has been a problem people discussed. Currently, about 97% of drugs sold by local Chinese manufacturers are generic. About 80% of drugs sold on Chinese domestic market are generic, with foreign-owned companies supply almost all of the innovation. So it's kind of a pretty bad, after so many decades, and even though other sectors China is seen as innovative and not in this area. So which is why I couldn't find anyone who have great knowledge about that sector when we're trying to compile the book. Now, however, there's something that changed quite dramatically after the middle 2010s. And this is the annual foreign venture capital investment in Chinese biotech. So you see a surge of foreign venture capital. So they smell some blood here. And if you look at the Chinese capital, again, same thing, right? Rapid surge around the time of 2014, 2015. And not only the large amount of money, but also look at the private versus state investment. A lot of private money comes in. So what this has to do, in fact, it has to do with China's, I'm not going to talk about the long detail about the pharmaceutical sector, but I want you to know to 2015, this is the time where Chinese drug administration has overhauled the policy that prior to that, the CFDA, which is Chinese FDA, are highly incompetent, corrupted, and ineffective, right? So some of you might have heard in 2006, the head of CFDA was executed, not by gang members, it's by he was sentenced death sentence for taking bribery. So it was pretty bad. But overall, the whole system has been corrupted and by various problems. After 2015, there are major policy overhauls. There are a series of policy reforms that finally open up the path for drug innovation. And the result is quite stunning. That in 2009, 5 biologics are biological medicine, biological drugs rather than chemical drugs. So 5 of them applied to clinical trial in China, 14 approved. This is adding previous application, right? Application from previous years. In 2018, 139 applied and 92 approved. So gigantic leap in number. CAR-T is immunization therapy, which are experimenting and quite promising for blood cancer and hopefully for other cancer as well. So the US have 259 clinical trials. China has 357. So it's a huge area of investment. Clinical trials is the sort of last stage, extremely expensive period, stage, right, for new drugs. And the PD-1, PD-L1 is also another highly successful and technology breakthrough for cancer treatment. Several leading Chinese companies produce PD-1, PD-L1 at a fraction of the cost of US price. So we're looking at the sectors and looking at the role of research institutions, these red and yellow dots. These are the patent collaboration graph we have mapped, and we can show the importance of research institutions. So the Chinese research institution and university are finally start to be able to produce new knowledge, as unlike the case in previous sectors, they're not that important, but in science-based sectors, they start to show they're quite important. What are the demand driving this? Unfortunately, demand is the rise of cancer. That Chinese cancer deaths has increased from 10% in 1973 to almost a quarter, and China have about a quarter of the world cancer burden. And if you look at compare US and China, right? So the probability of developing cancer in China prior to 75 years old is actually lower than the United States, but the probability of death from cancer prior to that is higher than the US. So you see a clear gap of unmet demand for medicine, right? So that has been something driving the biomedical sector innovation, as long as the sort of regulatory system has been fixed. So just very quick, the lessons is that again, Chinese industrial policy do not always work, if the regulatory system were not well established. And again, we're looking at the middle market, domestic demand. People need cancer drugs for their illness. And here we also see Chinese scientific establishment start to capable of producing new knowledge. However, it is not to say that these are like Chinese doing it in isolation. The reason they were able to create new knowledge had a lot to do with now they're populated by what we call returnees, people return from abroad, and most of the scientific workforces are also able to speak English, and they can tap into the global scientific commons. So I'm going to a few slides. I just return to the beginning that how you frame US-China technological competition. If you frame as a matter of domination, then only one can dominate, right? So it's became adversarial relationship. You win, I lose, or the other way around. And the strategy is play more barriers. Iran, having more barriers for each other. But if you conceptualize as it's a symbiotic and of course also competitive relationship, and then you have a different understanding of the exchanges of both in terms of money, technology, and people, and facing some of the common problems. My last slide is I wanted to have a plug-in for the US-China technology innovation, collaboration, if I may. What you see is the first page of a patent application. It's called Prefusion Coronavirus Spike Protein and their use. So it explains the technique that to stabilize coronavirus spike so that you could create that spike and generate human immunization responses. As you can imagine how important it is for vaccine, right? So it's the basic function of the vaccine, and almost older people who have a vaccine have these techniques. This pattern has been used for Pfizer, Moderna, and Johnson & Johnson vaccine. Now, the patent was collaboration of NIH researcher Barney Graham and Jason McLean. Jason McLean was also a collaborator of Tsinghua University. Tsinghua is China's MIT, right? The best university in China. So Jason McLean was the collaborator of Tsinghua University Professor Wang Xinquan. And they co-direct a PhD student whose name is Wang Nianshuang. Okay, so after graduating from PhD, Nianshuang worked with McLean for about 6 years to work on coronavirus. He spent 2 years in the lab to try to stabilize that spike. It's extremely difficult. And finally, they were able to achieve that. So they applied a patent in 2016, right? So that was way before coronavirus, the COVID-19. And, at the time, nobody really cared about this. But now it turns out to be the most important patent US government possess, right? All the pharmaceutical company were using it. So I think this is a good example, not only for like US-China collaboration, but also it's a good example of investment in basic research in both sides that, even if you don't really know its future applications. Okay, so that's the end of my talk, and thank you very much. I'm going to stop sharing my screen.
Thank you so much, Dr. Zhou. This is really, really informative. Now I will invite two of my colleagues, Lin Zhang from Communication at UNH and Andrew Earl from Management at UNH to have a conversation with our speaker. Each of you can ask 1 or 2 questions. Why don't we start with Andrew?
All right, Dr. Zhou, thank you so much for a fascinating talk. I first visited China in 2007 and went about once every other year for almost a decade. Fascinating to see what has changed and the fact that you're taking on the Herculean task of trying to map this in a way and share it with us is incredibly valuable. So you answered my initial question a little bit toward the end, but I wanted to get your take on what you would see for a path forward, or really in some ways a path back to facilitating collaboration between the US and China. I know that the narrative in the last couple of years has sort of devolved into something that's sort of competitive and isolating. But do you see a path back? And if so, what specific mechanisms do you think would be useful to bring back some of that spirit of collaboration?
Yes, thank you for your question. I'm afraid that I don't really have a good answer for it, because in part, I think the discussion is often along the line of geopolitical tensions. So I think it really has to do with how we frame the competition between US and China. I think there, certainly we cannot imagine full out collaboration. I think that's sort of out of the window. But even we think about it as a competition, we should think about it, realize it's a symbiotic, right? And because the way Chinese companies work are mostly building upon what the basic research and development in the US. And it is be difficult for the US companies sort of to create that kind of application that can reach into the middle market. So I think I was participating in several conversations, and unfortunately, I think that a lot of discussion right now is still shaped by geopolitical tension, and also a bunch of old guys talk about, oh, it's our intellectual property right. You can't use it. You can't use it. I mean, like, so it is really problematic, because intellectual property right, if you don't use it, it doesn't really have any value. So I think, unfortunately, but I do think science, hopefully people start to talk about science as a result of collaboration, rather than as something like, oh, big company as Moderna invented this, right? And I think that maybe one area that one can talk about is the sort of a contribution of Chinese American scientists, as well as both sides, to solve a problem. And in many ways, like cancer research, and the US company has built a lot of clinical trial in China. Almost 8% of registered clinical trial in the US are conducted in China, right? So these are important for drug development. I think there is a lot of potential for collaboration, I think, in the industry. Among the scientists, they understand that, but how do you break that to the policymakers is the question. I think in terms of I did hear the high-tech companies are start to lobby in some way that, because they need to sell it to China, and they're afraid if they don't sell it to China for many years, they'll pick something else, which will damage their long-term prospect. So I think people just have to be more understanding the industry. So, but right now, I'm not quite sure I'm optimistic on that score.
Thank you.
And maybe Ling.
Are you, I mean, can I turn the table, Andrew? Do you have some idea how to break the impasse?
Yeah, well, I mean, I think scientific collaboration is one of them. I think in the world of science, I try not to idealize it, but there is a certain set of shared standards and shared goals and shared processes that I think are a little bit possibly more difficult to find in industries that are competing more directly. So I'm not over idealizing science, but it seems to me like that may be one of the sort of places to start, or at least to try to defend and to hold on to the collaboration that currently exists.
Thanks. Yeah.
Okay, then it's my turn. Thank you so much, Professor Zhou, for the fascinating talk. It's really kind of informative to sort of have a updated conversation, but also in comparison to kind of historical experiences of many other different models. So I really learned a lot from that. So my question is also kind of, I have two questions. So both of them are kind of from historical and comparative perspectives. The first one is, it seems to me like you started basically with the after late 1970s, early 80s, when it was really like China's reform and opening up starting. And I have also been doing research on like Zhong Guancun, which kind of follows your steps and also inspired by your books and works. What I found is kind of an interesting continuity of the experience from and also you mentioned that in your book as well, from the socialist years. And for instance, the state-owned enterprises, their role, the role they played in China's innovation system at this moment. And also, I found a very interesting kind of comparison between the mass innovation and entrepreneurship campaign, 万众创业大众创新, and also the kind of a campaign style, very decentralized way of mobilizing resources during the socialist years. So I wonder if you can sort of comment on, you know, whether the Chinese socialist experience make it somehow different from, because you mentioned the Japanese, Korean, Taiwan, other East Asian models, and China is the only country that did have a kind of social experience. So I wonder if that kind of makes China different or unique in a way, especially when we are talking about, I've been reading a lot about Japanese experience because there was a trade war between Japan and United States as well in the 80s. And then the story was that the United States really pushed Japan to liberalize its financial sectors and all that. And there are a lot of kind of ad hoc advice about, you know, what Japan did right and did wrong in that period of time. The advice is to, in general, it seems to me like my observation is to follow Japan's kind of own path a little bit more. So I'm wondering, like, now China is also faced with this pressure to kind of liberalize, especially financial sector, whether, you know, there's some kind of suggestion. And the second question very quickly is from the recent news, I'm kind of excited to learn that Biden is coming up with a 2 trillion infrastructure investment. And a lot of that, I was looking at in the areas that he's gonna invest in: electric car, transportation, Amtrak, the kind of high-speed rail, and also advanced manufacturing. So I see a lot of kind of connection with China's experience there, and China's strengths there. So and also I hear a lot of kind of questions about, how we can fund it here in the United States. Some people saying, whether it's kind of possible to increase corporate tax, right? And also people have doubts about, the federal government and local government cooperating, because you mentioned high-speed rail is especially kind of a tricky area. So I wonder, the question is, do you have an advice for kind of probably the US, what the US could do or avoid, like from the China or other countries' model of experience? So that's my.
Well, thank you so much. That's like 3 questions, not 2 questions. So first is the connection with China's socialist past. I think certainly there are certain parts of. I'm a big believer that history is not just about disruption; it's about continuity. So I think that certainly during the socialist era, and their effort of sort of mass mobilizations has been used in certain circumstances, and there are also period which the entire nation seemed to work on certain technological breakthrough, and many Chinese call the so-called 两弹一星, the atomic bombs and satellite. However, I wanted to make really clear these are very, very different circumstances. So I think the effort of sort of using the national effort to build a particular technology can work in very limited circumstances, defense, high-speed rail probably, but perhaps nothing else. That I think that because semiconductor, it's not that the Chinese would never be able to make a semiconductor. It's just that the thing they made are not competitive internationally. So there's no need, companies wouldn't want to buy your product. So the idea to make something and to make something internationally competitive is very different. So I want to be warning that not to use that kind of experience to prove somehow China can develop these technology, because international competitiveness require engagement with international player, right? So I think that sort of the argument, often very simplistic argument about, oh, what Chinese can, we can't do it because we did it in the past, is actually very problematic comparison. So, and I'm not saying like socialist experience have nothing to offer, but we have to understand these are very different circumstances. In terms of China's comparison with Japan, and I think there are many areas China could learn a lot from Japanese experience, but there's one thing that is different China and Japan possess to sort of a US in relationship with the United States. My Japanese friend often talk about their, Japan are very innovative. So, but they often innovate certain standard and certain practice, but nobody else follow them. So this idea about leader without a follower is something that several Japanese scholars talk about, that they are very good at developing 3G prior to everybody else, but because nobody adopt their 3G standard, so they're like, okay, so they're not have much influence internationally. So China is different in the sense China does have global size market. I mean, not global market, but Chinese market is big enough. So it can create a technology which have global influence, like the 5G, almost sort of Huawei's technology, could have global influence. So I think that in that regard, the United States is much more worried about China. And it's also very difficult. Japan is a US ally geopolitically, so China is not. So that relationship will mark China quite different from Japan, whether it became more like Japan. So even though I do think that China have a lot to learn from Japan, I think in the technical standard and technical development, China has very different trajectories from Japan. The last question about Biden's, I'm glad to see the climate-related initiative and infrastructure, which is really shouldn't come long enough. But again, I'm not too optimistic at this point because we still have a Congress, right? You know, honestly, if we're looking at infrastructure development, the country which have the most experience is China. So, you know, it's better, you know, cost effectiveness that the US can collaborate with China, but geopolitically, I'm not quite sure that's the way it can go. So, I think it's still too early to tell whether or not the infrastructure upgrades in the United States, which is really should be happening, you know, much earlier than now, but at least there's some hope there. To what extent? I mean, I actually see no possibility of US can do this without China participate somehow, right? So whether directly or indirectly, it's like, you know, nowadays where we need everything of our home furnitures and they're all coming from China and not that for our intention. So I think it's unfolding relationship, you know. US have over the last 30 years outsourced way too much manufacturing industry. It's hard to bring them back. Oh, I mean, it's impossible to bring them all back. So some sort of collaboration probably had to go, but yeah. Okay, hope it's saying something, you know, yeah.
Thank you. So before I open it up, I want to use my privilege to sneak in one question, just one question.
Sure.
Because it's quickly, it's directly related to what Lin just asked. Because I remember that in your talk, you mentioned there is a sequence of models that China learned from, right? In the 1980s, it was from Taiwan, and then in the 90s, it's Korea, and then 2000s, US, and perhaps after 2010, it's from Germany. So I was wondering, is it more like a sequence or is it a coexistence of different models? Because if you look at, for example, what happens to China's semiconductor industry today, you see all of these models. You see, for instance, science parks built by Tsinghua University's enterprises, and you also see national champions like Unigroup, right? And then you see US financialized models, including the so-called government-guided funds. Mm-hmm. And then I'm not quite sure whether there is a German model in there, but we do see this coexistence of these models. So what do you see this? How do you see this? Do you see this as a sequence or do you see these are coexistence?
Yeah, I think that's a great question. Because China did not have its own model to begin with, so it has experiments by learning from all these models, from Taiwan model, and then realize, oh gosh, we don't have, this model doesn't work for high, you know, capitalized sector, so we need to learn from Korea. And then like, oh, the US is doing this innovation this way, so we should do that too. So there's a lot of sort of ad hoc part like to address certain part of the issue, so as the historical development. But I think you're right, they are coexisting because frankly none of these models can apply. A country like China is so big, right? And they try to keep most of the production chain, at least keep parts of a supply chain within China. So you have this sort of intermixing of various models, just like you said, in the semiconductor sector. And to me, is a way to work out what eventually perhaps work best in Chinese model. But I would never think that China would be able to create a single model just because it's one of the most comprehensive, a country with comprehensive industrial structure. So it has many different sectors. So yeah, but I certainly, I think all these models would have imprint. It's like layered on top of each other, right? So how do you sort out these layers, and what eventually work out, it's going to be quite different. Yeah.
Thank you. So now I will take questions from the Q&A session. I would like to prioritize our own students. I always prioritize my own students. The first question from Ben Welsh. He asked, do you think China's past lax laws on IPR have limited its technological development, as businesses from the West are wary to license their IPs in China in case it gets stolen?
I'm not sure what Max law you mean, but
I think he meant lax.
Oh, Lex law. Okay. So China's IPR law, in fact, were not lax. They actually did a really pretty rigorous law compatible to the United States. But it's what is lax is the enforcement, right? So increasingly, however, the law has been enforced more and more in many sectors. In the pharmaceutical sector, it has always been enforced quite stringently. So as a result of it, China actually had more IP litigations than the United States. So a lot of people suing each other. Whether that's a great thing or not, I'm not quite sure. I don't know. It's I think absolutely there are Western companies who are worried about licensing laws, license their IP in China or work with Chinese companies. Is certainly a huge worry for many companies. However, companies always, what I find though in the high-tech companies in Western companies in China is that they are actually quite capable of protecting their IP, and they have various ways to, break apart into different segments and so on. So, and the complex IP are actually not easy to copy. Not if your IP is about how to design a chair, and that could be very easily copied. But if your IP is about biological procedures, and that's not easy. And if your IP is about the semiconductor and the layout of it's a circus, that's not easy to copy. So I actually think that the companies are pretty capable themselves to choose whether they work with China or not, because if you are designing chairs, you probably don't expect your IP being that much protected. But most companies, high-tech company in particular, are pretty good at doing it. Yeah.
Thank you. Our next question is from Yifei Sun from Cal State.
He's not your student.
He's not my student, of course. He asks, what impacts will the current US-China technological war have on the national models of innovation in the US and China? Which one has a better chance to win out?
I think US and China tech war is something that is ongoing, that none of us really have a good answer to this question. And I think that to talk about who wins perhaps is not what I wanted to say, because what do you mean by winning, right? So I would say their short-term impact, as I mentioned before, to block parts for Chinese companies will likely to slow Chinese company down, and may also damage a company like Huawei would become much less able to innovate in the frontier, and perhaps losing a lot of its market, and it already does. So it was certainly damaging a lot of Chinese companies as a result of it. However, my general sense is that the Chinese I think people probably agree with me that Chinese will use cell phones. So, and they will want a better cell phone still, regardless whether Huawei is the brand. So you will have Chinese company to try to improve their technology with or without American suppliers. So as long as the demand is there, company will try to do it. So I think in that sense, it's like people will still have cancer. So people will still, regardless whether you can access US technology, these scientists will try to work on the cancer treatment. So in the long run, it's possible that they would work out the solutions. And these, if they do so, it would become a problem for existing solution providers, I think. So I don't know about winning, but I do not see a prospect of Chinese companies stop innovation, stop responding to the market need of the population.
Thank you. Our next question is from Mei Jun Chen, who's a master's student at ETH Zurich. She or he, I can't tell the gender. Do you see the renewable energy sector, wind and solar PV, is only able to be driven by top-down mechanism, since energy sector is traditionally capital intensive and natural monopoly? Is there a possibility of bottom-up innovation for solar PV, for example, since wind turbine technology usually has high complexity and thus harder to learn?
I think alternative energy market is somewhat different in the sense that market has to be created by the state, right? Because the alternative energy, you have to price it in a particular way. You have to make sure it can connect to your national grid. So these are the actions state would have to do in order to have viable alternative energy market. At this point, solar energy are predominantly non-state-owned companies, and they're still predominantly export, although the Chinese state is making some effort to encourage solar panels within China. But these tends to be non-state-owned companies. But wind turbine, however, tends to be state-owned companies, and they are much more targeting in Chinese market. The grassroots level, I would say in both solar and wind, there are many companies competing. So we're not having a state-dominant sort of a player, that kind of system. So it is pretty competitive landscape, but in a way, they're all hinged upon the Chinese state provide some pricing and subsidies or certain level pricing permissions and to allow these renewable energy being part of national grid. I don't know whether that answer your question. Yeah, I mean, I think there are a lot of wind powered companies in China. So it is a pretty, each region sort of have their own. So it's pretty competitive. Although I have to say competitive nationally, but regionally, they tends to be centered because these are state-owned companies. They tend to be prioritized within their own region. Yeah.
Thank you. Just a quick follow-up from Professor Sun. He says, I'm asking on the national models of innovation, not necessarily on business information. Follow up to the previous question that he asked.
Unfortunately, I don't think that I can answer that because I cannot specify what exactly is Chinese model of innovation. Chinese model of innovation so far has been derivative. So if you're asking that if US stops supplying with Chinese with parts, then it can be derivative. But if that is the case, I actually don't exactly see that happening because the impact will be too huge for US tech firms. So yeah, I do not see, and I hope I do not see China return to an internal sort of a driven model, which was the socialist era, which works in only extremely narrow cases.
Cool. Our next question is from Elaine Yuan, who asked, can Dr. Zhou elaborate a bit on the significance of a large market on innovation?
Yeah, that's a very good question. I think we often de-emphasize the role of markets in innovations. And I think that the role of market in innovation can be seen in numerous areas. One is the scale, right? Economy of scale, so to reduce the cost of particular innovation. Right. And so the United States has been the most innovative country in the world, but this also has to do, it's not just Americans are smarter and they can say Americans are innovative, but also the fact that American market is really big. So if you have something, you have a big market could support you in terms of getting that reward. So the size has to do with the economy of scale. So you have the cheaper product to sell to this market. And the United States, being the dominant hegemonic power of the world, could also have much of the world at its disposal. So really that created, that's the other side why the US company are seeing the most innovative. So you could have the smartest innovation in Singapore if your market is just Singapore, or for that matter, Japan. Japan is very innovative, but they haven't been breakthrough in terms of international market. So this idea of, you know, innovator, but a leader, but not having followers. So that's one side, size of the market. The other thing, the large market could also provide with diversity of demand, right? So the Chinese cell phones are diverse in responding to various, you know, low income, so you get a really affordable cell phone, and people who use cell phone for businesses which are transnational. So you have cell phone with multiple chips, you know, SIM chips. So you could go from countries without having a problem. So these are specific demands that a large market could produce. And then as a result of it, you have this cell phone producers that cater to different demand. So I think that is sort of a diversity is another aspect of why large market matter. Large market also matter in terms of technological standard, right? So if you develop certain technology standard, TikTok, for example, right? So certain graphic video, and if you have a very large market, it allows you to improve that product to the point that can be used for even bigger market. So I think that a large market have a huge impact, I think, in terms of technology use and, you know, electric cars, right? How do you develop certain kind of electric car standard? If you have a tiny market, you know, it's not going to go anywhere. But if you have a large market, you have diversity of circumstances, diversity of use, diversity of land conditions. You'll be able to develop strategies and techniques in response to that, so you will have better cars. So I think there are so many ways I do think a large market could support innovation.
Thank you. I know this is already 5, but I do want to take one more question from the audience. I try to combine these 2 questions together because they are really related. Ima asks you, how can you explain China's innovation model with its test-oriented repressive education system that is not supposedly amenable to innovation? And another question is sort of related, which asks, how does China's culture of creativity and innovation impact the long prosperous consumerism?
Okay, that's very interesting. I think one of the theory previously is that, oh, Chinese are not creative because the education system is too rigid. I agree the education system is too rigid, but I also would like to argue that people are creative no matter what your education system is. And the other things too, you don't really need that many creative people. It doesn't mean everybody has to be creative, but it's good for kids to be creative. But if you really look at industry innovation, you need a creative mind. You also need a lot of people doing the work. It's like that postdoc from Tsinghua University. He did, he's creative, but he also did years and years and years, just trial and error in the lab and try different things, right? I think you do need a variety of labor force, but at the same time, I also argue that Chinese education system are not the only one responsible to create talents anymore. And there are many Chinese who have hybrid background from, and there are many returnees from US, Europe, Japan. So China actually have a diverse background, and therefore you can have sort of a diverse leaders. And then as many other people who are working help to make these vision a reality. So I think somehow I think the creativity is somewhat overrated in the sense like you don't need everybody being most creative. So but there are diversity of education now in the Chinese tech field.
Thank you so much.
What was the other question you were saying? I forgot. What was the other one?
Oh, the other one about the they are kind of related. The first one is about creative culture, and the other one is about repressive, test-oriented education system.
I mean, but the other thing you also have to see is that Japan, Korea are no less test-dominated culture. And unless we can argue Japan, Korea people are not innovative or not creative, I don't think I can. So goes Chinese won't be, non-creative either. So, yeah.
Thank you, Dr. Zhou. This is really a great talk, and your answers to these questions are also very informative. I think we have to stop here because it's already 5:06. Again, it's our great honor to have you here, Dr. Zhou. And I want to thank you, my two colleagues, Ling and Andrew. Thank you for helping me with this event. And I also want to thank our UNH webinar manager, Andy Dole, whose techniques make this whole thing possible. And I want to thank you all for participating in this event, and I will see you later. Thank you.
Well, thank you so much. If you don't mind, I could don't yet close it down so I can take a look at the questions.
Oh, sure, of course.
Else would be happy to, right.
You can also send a report of all the questions by email if that would be easier.
Yeah, that might be easier. So yeah, thank you, because I didn't quite have time to really do that. So yeah, but sure. Yeah, I hope it worked out. Thank you so much. It was a lot of fun. Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay.
I believe this is not broadcasting, is it?
No, it is. We're still once we start broadcasting, there's no way to stop.
Oh, okay.
Okay.
All right.
Okay. So
okay.
it's not broadcasting. So.
Thank you so much.
Thank you, Andrew.
All right. Thank you. Bye-bye.